Good afternoon. It's good to be with you again. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you again. And it's always good for me to come up and see my family, because we probably don't see each other as much as you think we do. And so this is a really good way for me to see them, and they can't get away from me this way. We've been studying at Elliottsville some teachings of Jesus, and so fresh on my mind is the account that we find in John. If you want to turn with me over to John chapter 15. In John chapter 15, we see the account of the vine and the branches. And some say this is a parable, but it doesn't really start out saying it's a parable. We're just going to call it an allegory. But when you look at the book of John, one of the things that you see in the book of John is a bunch of I am statements. And so John's I am statements, would make a great series of lessons, actually, because he mentions several things here. He starts off by saying, before Abraham was, I am. And so that really sets the tone for who God is. He also calls Jesus the bread of life. I am the bread of life. He sustains us. He's the light of the world. The light of the world provides us direction. He is the door. I am the door, one way of entrance, one way to God. He is also the shepherd. I am the shepherd. I'm the good shepherd, that he leads us and goes before us and shows us the way. He's also the resurrection. I am the resurrection. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He is our genuine way to God. And this passage in John chapter 15 says, I am the vine. And so this particular statement is directed to us as believers and calls us to have a responsibility. There is a responsibility that we have. And so this whole section of Scripture here is about our accountability and our faithfulness. And we need to consider this. And so our text here, the timing of this is the discourse right before Jesus was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so at this time, we know that he's trying to prepare his disciples that he's not going to be around much longer. And so he wants to educate them and encourage them in their work so that can continue after he leaves. But before we get into the meat of this account, I want you to consider some facts about vineyards. Vineyards had quite a history with the nation of Israel, and it was a crucial part of Israel's history. There was always a grapevine growing around somewhere with Israel, and it was pointed out many times in the Old Testament that grapes were needed for food. It was also something that would ferment and help purify water. And when we look at prophecy, there's a lot that's said about vineyards. One particular case is in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. And we'll read that, Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7. Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it, and also hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it only produced worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there for me to do in my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. And so you could see here the allegory here, the illustration used of the vineyard is Israel is God's vineyard. And in this passage, the Lord through Isaiah speaks of how Israel was his beloved vineyard. And had God done everything for Israel that could be done? Had he done everything for this vineyard that could possibly be done? Well, yes, the prophet says everything had been done for this vineyard to be successful. There was nothing more that could be done. And when you think about Israel, what more could God have done for Israel than that he didn't do? But what did the vineyard in this example do? So, well, you didn't produce anything. You didn't produce anything any good. You produce worthless grapes, things that can't be used. So, because of that, there's going to be judgment. And that's not unusual when you look at these books of prophecy. You know, there's a lot of judgment that is foretold in here. And in this particular case, it's using this example of expecting something good and getting something bad, and therefore judgment was declared against this vineyard or Israel in particular. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go and look at John and his account, but in also some other passages that we're not going to take the time to read tonight. But in Psalm 80, if you go turn and read to that, you'll see that the psalmist is mourning because there is a vineyard and it has been burned and has been cut down. And there is a pleading for restoration that, you know, we need this back. We need it to be restored. Also, the prophet Jeremiah, who has some things to say about, you know, vineyards. He said in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21, "Yet I planted you a choice vine, a completely faithful seed. How then have you turned yourself before me into the degenerate shoots of a foreign vine? Although you wash yourself with lye and use much soap, the stain of your iniquity is before me, declares the Lord God." And so you can see here another example of this illustration of a vine being used to pronounce judgment upon Israel and to tell Israel, you're not doing what you are supposed to do. You are supposed to be a completely faithful seed, but you are a degenerate one, and you wash yourself, and it's you know, not really helping. So here, the Lord presenting his case against Israel notes that they were planted as a good thing, but what came up was something wild. In Ezekiel chapter 17, again, Israel is compared to a good planted vine that turns towards something else. And in that particular case, in Ezekiel 17, it's talking about you're turned toward another god. And so what's going to happen to that vine? Well, it's going to be pulled up. And so all of these texts help us explain what God expected of his people. God expected of his people to produce something that was good, that everything had been provided for the vineyard to be successful and produce good fruit. And then that didn't happen. Also, we see in the New Testament some parables that talk about vineyards or vine dressers. And so in Matthew chapter 20, you've got the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, and they came at different times of day, and they were all, you know, paid the same thing. So that's another illustration of a vineyard used to make a point there. And also the parable of the landowner, where the son came back and the son was rejected. And of course that represents Jesus, who was rejected by his people when God sent him. And that's another example of a vineyard being used as an illustration by Jesus Christ. Finally, in Luke chapter 13, we see the example of an unproductive fig tree. And I know that figs don't grow on a vine, you know, it's a tree, but same type of illustration here, that the fig tree that's not producing figs, it's not doing what it's intended to do. Just like the vine that doesn't produce grapes, the fig tree that doesn't produce figs, it's not really good for anything. And in Luke chapter 13, you see that, you know, attempts are made for 3 years, you know, for three cycles of where you're supposed to be seeing something happen and nothing's happening. And it failed, and it would be cut off. So all that said, in introduction here to John, do you think Israel would understand an illustration about vines. Yeah. They would understand this, and those that Jesus is speaking to certainly understood very well the spiritual analogy of vineyards as it related to the nation of Israel. And so he's speaking something that his disciples and the listeners are familiar with, and perhaps Jesus might even have been passing a vineyard when he made this analogy. Whatever the case, he made it certainly applicable to those that were hearing, and we can see great emphasis on this particular illustration that they would understand. So let's look here at chapter 15. Chapter 15, starting in verse 1. I am the vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. And as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. And so you see here, there is a lot that is being said. And if you remember the lesson that I did last time that I was here, we looked at the first chapter of 2 Corinthians. And we noted a word that was used over and over, and it was comfort. If you remember that lesson, we talked about comforting, and you are comforted so that you can comfort somebody else. And I think, I don't remember how many times comfort was used there, but did you notice a word that was used a lot here? Abide, 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 abide. It's abide. And so that's important, that the branch has to abide in the vine. And that is what you're going to notice as we go through this, is that word is used over and over for a reason. And so let's look at some point by point at this illustration here. And so this allegory, where Jesus starts out saying that he is comparing himself to something. He says, I am the vine. I am the true vine. He is the one that sustains us. And so, like everything else that Jesus used when he's doing all of his I am statements in the book of John, that in this case he is the vine. And so what does the vine do for the branches? Well, obviously the branches can't survive without the vine. The vine is the sustainer for the branches. And so we're going to see several different applications to this as we go through. And we also note the vine dresser. Who's the vine dresser? Well, as we saw in the Old Testament, the vine dresser was God. God is the one that provided everything that you needed for the vineyard. We have his spiritual kingdom, and we see that everything is under God's control. He manages it. And then we have the branches. And the branches here, this should not be something that's controversial. It's very easy to see what it is. And the reason I say could be controversial, because some people see this and say, well, the branches are denominations, or the branches are different types of churches. And the church hadn't even been established yet when this was said. So this is not talking about that here the vine is the universal church, and the branches are all the denominations. The denominational world try to make that case with this parable, but you can see that doesn't fit the context at all. You, my disciples, you are the branches. I'm the vine, you are the branches. It doesn't say I'm the vine and all the different churches that are going to come out and be divisive, years from now are going to be the branches. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about the disciples. It's talking about us. And so we consider how the branches bear the likeness to the vine, or should. And if you recall James chapter 3, James says in James chapter 3, verse 12, that a grapevine does not produce figs. Why is that? Well, I don't need to explain that to anybody here. That's not the way that happens. A grapevine is going to produce grapes. A fig tree is going to produce figs. And James is saying that you're like your Creator. And so you are going to be, the branches are going to be like the vine. They're going to have the characteristics of the vine. They are interconnected. You're not going to plant one thing and get something else. And that leads us to the next point, is that there is fruit involved. And so we have the branches, which is us, and we have the fruit, the things that are produced. And so that's very important. And that's what you see in each one of these passages that we've looked at, is that there is something expected of the vine. There's something expected of the vineyard and its fruit. If you drive down to Clanton, you're expecting to get peaches, right? And so if there's no peaches down in Clanton, there's nothing on the trees, then they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And so the trees, the vines are producing fruit. And so what are some applications that we can make? I think that they're pretty obvious here, but verse 5 is really key to that. And it goes back to what we said before, that we are in Him. We are in Him. We are in Jesus Christ. Verse 5 says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I am He it is that bears much fruit. And so, number one, we are in Him. Verse 5 is key to that. And we need to be in Him. In Galatians chapter 3, we're told that when we are baptized into Christ, we put on Christ. And so when we become Christians, then there's a change in relationship. And so we need to understand that. And so we are connected with Jesus. We abide with Jesus when we are one of His children. Another analogy that you see throughout especially in Paul's writings, is the analogy of a body. That the church is a body. The body is the church. The church is the saved. And who's the head of the body? Well, Christ is the head of the body. And what happens to the body without a head? We've all heard about chickens with their head cut off, and I think Jarrell has actually seen that before. I've never actually seen it. I don't have any desire to go looking for that. But, what's going to happen to the chicken without its head? It's eventually going to run into something. It's going to die. It's not going to survive. It can't survive for long. Maybe it can run around a little bit, but it's not going to work out well. And if you want more information, just Google it. The chicken's not going to exist without a head. And what's the church going to do without the head? Wait, what is the branch going to do without the vine? Nothing. It can't survive. The branch cannot survive without the vine. We are all connected to the vine. And so being with the vine, it sustains us. Abiding in the vine sustains us. And that is exactly what the point is here that John is saying in verses 4 and 5. If He's not sustaining you, what is going to happen to your fruit? There's not going to be any fruit. If He's not sustaining you, there is not going to be any fruit. And there you need to bear fruit. And a fruit is outgrowth of that relationship of abiding in Christ. And so without me, He says, you can do nothing. Well, that's pretty obvious in this illustration. 2 Corinthians tells us that all of our sufficiency is from God and that we need Him. And so next point is we need Jesus. We need to abide in Him. And I think we all know what that word means, to abide. And to abide in something means not just a one-time thing, not just, okay, well, you've been baptized and now you don't ever have to think about Jesus anymore. The idea of abiding is to dwell. If you say that you abide in your home, that doesn't mean that you're just visiting. That's a place that you stay. And we all understand that in basic English. And this word abide is used 10 different times in this passage. And it's implied even more than that when he says, and I and you, that in I and you in verses 4 and 5, that's also talking about abiding. And so that's really the main emphasis here in this account in John. So the idea of abiding in him is a continued relationship where we are dependent on him to sustain us. Continual action there. And so unless we are in him, we are not going to bear fruit. And this is pretty well understood in all the types of gardening that I try to not involve myself in. But we've got a tree in our front yard that was planted years ago, and that tree has grown up a lot bigger than we ever thought it would. And you know what's happened to all the grass under it? Well, it's dead. The grass under it is dead. And so last year I spent a lot of money planting grass under it, but I didn't plant the right grass. It sprung up, and this particular grass, when the tree is blooming, the grass is not getting any sunshine. And so I need to plant some grass that doesn't care about sun, because it's not getting anything. And so when we talk about gardening, we know some basic thoughts about that. If there's not a root, if there's not some place for the root to go, if the plant can't get any sustenance, we all know this from the parable of the sower, right? The seed that falls on the rocky ground and the thorny ground, it's not going to take root, especially that falls on the wayside. It doesn't have a chance of growing because there's no way for it to grow because it has no sustenance. Simply will not produce anything. And so we understand this. It's understood in gardening for sure. And we can read in John chapter 12. Let's just turn back over there for a second. In John chapter 12, we see that there were some that believed in Christ, but they were not ones that did anything about it. And in fact, there were many that heard Christ, that saw the miracles that he did, and decided, well, I think I could follow him, but I have reasons that I'm not going to. Verse 22 or verse 42 and 43 of John chapter 12. Nevertheless, many of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, for they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. In John chapter 9, you also see the parents of the blind man that knew exactly what had been done for their son, but wouldn't tell anybody about it because they had the same fear. So you read all the time about disciples that, they kind of believe, but did they bear any fruit? No, they didn't bear any fruit because nothing was done with that belief. Sadly, they produced nothing. And what a shame, because they could have been effective in spreading the word about Jesus Christ. So it really gets down to the main point of what is being recorded for us here in John 15. What was Jesus' point? He's saying, I'm expecting all of you to bear fruit. That I am expecting you to bear fruit, and if you don't bear fruit, bad things are going to happen. And so that cannot be misunderstood or overemphasized, that is the fact that as Christians, we are called upon to bear fruit, to be productive. And when Jesus said, abide in me, he's talking about abiding in me and bearing fruit. So what is the fruit? Well, it can be lots of different things. It's certainly more than coming to a service a couple of times a week. There's growth that ought to be happening. If a child is born, one of the things that's done quite a bit early on is the doctor's telling you what percentile their growth is, right? And so if they're not growing as fast as whatever normal is, then they're going to start looking at that and say, we need to look at their nutrition. We need to look at some other things. What's going on? Because there is a certain amount of growth that happens. And wouldn't it be interesting if we had some kind of scale as Christians? Randy, you've been a Christian for a long time, and you really ought to be you're here and you ought to be here. There's things that you ought to know. There's things that over the years, and we see that sometimes in our workplaces. How long have you been working here? Don't you? And somebody asks you a question that's so basic that you can't believe that they're asking you that. But it happens, doesn't it? At some point, you ought to assimilate some things and learn some things. And as Christians, if somebody just looks the part and appears in a church building once in a while, we think that they're okay. But there's growth, there's fruit that ought to be happening. We need to grow in wisdom and knowledge, Peter says. Colossians tells us that we need to be involved in good works. Righteous living, Paul wrote in Philippians. Living lives of holiness, and the fruits of the Spirit are recorded. And so there's a wealth of knowledge and wealth of things that we can look at and say, am I growing the way that I should? And of course, a lot of it has to do with, are we bringing others to Christ? Are we talking about others? And so when you talk about, you're talking a lot about bearing fruit. Well, what exactly is that? There's a lot of information in the Scripture that helps us know what that is. And so when Jesus is talking to his disciples here, he's preparing to die. And he's wanting to encourage those disciples that you need to keep on teaching what I'm teaching. I'm preparing you because you are going to be expected to bear fruit. And historically we can look at their lives and we can tell that they did that they took this instruction well and did exactly what Jesus expected of them. So it's also important just to point out the proper flow of this teaching. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm going to tell you that we are not saved because we bear fruit. We bear fruit because we're saved. And when we are Christians, the vine and the branches imagery helps us with that. The reason that the branch bears fruit is because it's connection with the vine. The branch is not going to bear anything by itself. And so it is our connection with Christ that is going to help us bear fruit. And we need to stay connected to the vine. The branch cannot be disconnected from the vine and bear fruit. And so, okay, well, I'm bearing fruit now, so now I'm going to go try to get connected to the vine. No, that's not the illustration here. If fruit only comes when the branch is first connected to the vine. And so this means that we can evaluate our lives and see, do I see spiritual fruit or not? Well, if I'm not bearing fruit, then there's a problem, right? And that's pretty clear. And I need to do that. And Jesus warns us about what happens when you're not bearing fruit, which we'll see in just a second. But another thing that Jesus says here about being part of the vine and being a branch is that the branch is going to be pruned once in a while. And why is that done? Well, when you have plants that you need to take care of, you go out and prune them, and we have the crepe myrtle that's taking over our house that we cut back every year, and we cut it back. I guess it was February or something when I finally did it, and now it's growing so much. It's I imagine what would it have been like if I hadn't pruned it? It would be eating away at the side of the house, and so we've got some plants over at the church building, and so there's parts of the shrubs that are dying. So you go cut off the bad branches and the parts that are dead so that you can have new growth. And so when Jesus uses this illustration here of, well, you're going to be pruned, I don't know that I like that too much to think about that, but if we're not disciplined and pruned, then there's going to be a problem. So as Christians, I think we understand that we need to be clipped once in a while. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh, that we don't know what that was. People speculate about what it was, but Paul prayed 3 times that it would be removed, and it wasn't. And Paul brings it up that the grace of God is sufficient. That's what he was told. And so I kind of consider that as being Paul's pruning a little bit, that everything that Paul wanted in life, he wasn't getting. And I imagine there were some other things that he didn't care for either, as far as the persecutions and things that he endured. But when you look at the book of 2 Corinthians, like we're doing right now, you see over and over Paul is talking about some of the things that have hindered him and some of the things that are unpleasant. But he always talks about how those things have helped him, how those things have helped him grow. And I think we all understand that. Hebrews chapter 12 talks about the chastening of the Lord, and then the intended result is good, and it's that afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. There's that word again, fruit. That discipline or chastening is going to produce fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. I think parents understand that, and children that are parents now, and they can look back. And when I was a kid, I probably would have looked at this verse and some of the things that are written in Psalms and Proverbs and say, well, that's Dad's favorite verse. He's the spare the rod and spoil the child, and the rod of correction. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. I always considered those to be Dad's favorite verse. Well, why did he employ those methods? Was it because he just loved giving us spankings? Sometimes I thought he did. But no, it's because Hebrews tells us exactly why. Hebrews 12 says, you understand that fathers will direct a child and chasten a child because it's good for the child. And when you grow up and you look back at those things, you can be thankful for the upbringing that you had and the direction that you got. I'm not saying that parents always do it right, but I know that God does. God always does this right. And so when Hebrews talks about the chastening of the Lord, that's going to be something, if I react in the right way to it, Hebrews says afterwards it results in something good. It results in fruit, the peaceable fruit of righteousness. So in this life, Christians are going to face difficulties, and those things can make us better or stronger, or it can defeat us, but we want it to make us stronger. And so those kind of things, when Jesus here talks about the pruning that is going on, he's talking about those that are still good branches. You branches that are bearing fruit, you're going to be pruned, and so you're going to be chastened, and we need to realize that. But that's not the end of the story here. There's some that are going to be cut off, and so there are the branches that are not bearing fruit. If you are non-productive, verse 6 says, if anyone does not abide in me. Let's look at verse 6. Verse 6, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. So, the wording here is very difficult to misunderstand, that there is a warning here that if you are not productive, you will be cast out. So is not bearing fruit an option? Is that one of the options that we can choose? No. Not bearing fruit is not an option. Bearing fruit is the only option. You just have option A, and there's no B. You just get that one. And so how does that happen? Well, the scriptures teach us that we can walk away. We can become unfaithful. You can simply be like the one-talent man and do nothing. Or you may not ever technically leave the Lord, but if you're not producing fruit, then are you in danger? Yeah. Verse 2 says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. That's not good. And so these, this is important to understand. And so this is also important to understand if you're ever talking to somebody that thinks they can't lose their salvation. That this is a good text to look at when somebody says, I can't lose my salvation. Was the branch ever part of the vine? Well, yeah, the branch was part of the vine. What does that mean? So they were abiding with the vine at some point, but then the vine was not bearing fruit, and so then the branch was cut off from the vine and thrown into the fire. But if once saved, always saved is true, then there's no way that branch is ever going to be cut off. But somebody may say, well, the branch was really never part of the vine. No, how can you even be a vine? How can you ever be a branch if you're not part of the vine? How can you ever be a branch if you're not part of the vine? The only way that it even becomes a branch is it's part of the vine. And so that cannot represent what sometimes people want to make it. Would it be comforting to think, whatever I do, I'm never going to lose my salvation? If that were true, I'd love that. But it's not true. And what's being taught here is there's judgment for the one that is not bearing fruit. Galatians chapter 5, verse 4 says, you have fallen from grace. And how do you fall from something that you never had? How does the branch get cut off from that? Well, not bearing fruit, falling from grace. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1 talks about fearing lest one come short of eternal rest. And there's warning after warning. Hebrews chapter 2 warns us about drifting away. And if that's not really an issue, if that's not really a fear that we should be thinking about, then that's just wasted words. And I don't ever get the impression that God is wasting his words on something that's not important. So verse 6, he is cast out as a branch and withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. I don't need to explain what that means, do I? What does the fire represent, Randy? It represents judgment. There's fruit that's not being produced here, and so this is a clear reference to eternal judgment. Matthew chapter 25, verse 41 talks about the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Revelation chapter 21 speaks about those who will have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. And this is the same lake in Revelation 20 that is prepared for the devil. And so that's not anything that anybody wants for themselves. And so when you look at this analogy in John chapter 15, who are the branches? We are the branches. What do the branches need to do? They need to be abiding in the vine, and when they abide in the vine, they're going to produce fruit. And if they're not producing fruit, then they're going to be cut off from the vine, and they're going to be cast into the fire. And that's not good. So Jesus says what happens to those who refuse to do this, they are burned. So the question for us is, are we bearing fruit? It's a real obvious lesson for us. What are we producing? Are we producing anything? Continuing on with the plant analogy, do you feel like you're withering? Do you feel like you're drying up spiritually? Do you feel like you're withering spiritually? Because when that happens, why is it happening? Because you're not connected. You're not connected with the vine like you should be. And so you've been cut off. You are withering. And we can see that in nature, can't we? If you go and cut branches down off of a tree and you need to use it as firewood, or you need to chop it up and use it later, when are you going to do that? I'm usually going to leave it in a pile for several days and wait for it to get real dried up and real withered before I do anything else with it, because it's going to be easier, because it's going to be more dead. And when you're not connected to the source of life, you see what happens in nature. We've got, some storms that have come through recently, and when you drive into our neighborhood, you can see some branches that have broken off. And I keep wondering, when is Helena going to clean this up? And so day after day, it gets more brown, more brown, more brown. This branch that's holding on to the tree that used to give it life, but it has no life anymore because it's totally disconnected from what gave it life before. And so we are the same way. We need to be connected to God. We need to be connected to Christ. And so, what is the result of that? Well, verse 8 says, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples." So the result of all this, the result of being the kind of disciple that you should be and bear fruit, God is glorified. And so faithfulness is so important. Number one, faithfulness is important because God is glorified by our faithfulness, and that's the reason that we exist. We exist for God's glory, not for our own glory or trying to get accolades in the world, but we are to be lights of the glory of God to the ends of the earth. Second, we prove that we are disciples of Christ. So, my Father is glorified that you may bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. So two things going on there. You glorify God and you prove to be a disciple of Christ. So it's not possible to be a disciple of Jesus and not show ever increasing fruit. And so when we remain in Christ, when we abide in Him, Father's going to prune us and we're going to be more and more fruitful. And we can, we can face challenges and difficulties in life, and those things can be used for the glory of God, and we can bear more fruit for Jesus all the time. So I hope this was useful to you and an encouragement to you that we need to be encouraged to bear fruit. I know this is a very familiar account to